We live in a fantasy world now. Reality has been destroyed.
This is the time that we really need to pay attention.
The probabilities are overwhelmingly on gold's side. That is the best environment to see gold increase its value.
Welcome to Palisades Gold Radio. I'm your host, Tom Bodrovics. Joining me today is David Murrin, global forecaster and author. How are you today, David? I'm
in great form. It's been lovely warming up with you, Tom.
Absolutely. We've had an excellent chat here so far, and we've got a lot to get through today. And after going through some of your website, your work is very profound, and you've had the ability to predict a lot of different things. And, a good example of that, and obviously very topical right now, is in December 2021, you made the prediction that Russia would invade Ukraine in early 2022. And, I've listened to countless hours of podcasts about that recently, done a lot of interviews about it. And many people were kind of caught off guard when Russia did actually invade Ukraine. So what data points led you to make that prediction, and what had changed in the situation around December 2021 that prompted you to put that prediction out?
Actually, the prediction goes back even further than that, funny enough, but we'll just say December 21. So the genesis of the architecture is, first of all, my theory on the 5 stages of empire. So that 5 stages of empire model of regionalization, a civil war, which is a migration from linear thinking to lateral thinking, which is then expansive and allows the expansion to empire process to take place, has a pause when the empire can't expand anymore, and then essentially moves into maturity and highly integrative, highly tolerant. And then this thing at the top, which no one noticed, which is another civil war. Sometimes it's blood, sometimes it's like a constitutional revolution around Queen Victoria, where in fact all the lateral people are pushed out by the linear people because the empire is now really stable. Of course, there is no longer uncertainty, and they can run political organizations, and these mavericks aren't needed. And that starts the decay function into overextension and finally decline, which is essentially when the system is non-adaptive because it's kicked out all the people that are adaptive and created it. And the observation that when you go and look at Britain and its whole relationship with Europe, that there was something different about the empires I studied. They were much shorter, Portugal and Spain and Holland, and then along came France and then Britain, and then America, and Germany tried twice. Things became a lot more complicated. And of course, I asked the question about, hey, man, is it about technology? Did they shorten the cycles? And it suddenly dawned on me. The real meme wasn't a national meme of organization. It was a religious Christian meme. And so the Western super Christian empire, as I called it, is a super empire of an agglomeration of nation states. It started off in a Catholic form, and the civil war between Catholics and Protestants was about liberation of creative thought. A good example of Catholics being linear and Protestants at that time being more lateral in their perspective of direct connection to their God. It freed their minds, and it freed the concept of creating global maritime power rather than continental European power. And with that came the realization that America was the last of the Christian empires, and in 2001, it started its 5th stage of decline. And so we were in the biggest power vacuum we'd ever seen. And there was another system rising up, which is the Super Asian system. And we've been struggling with it because Japan was the first empire and China was the second, starting with the Boxer Revolution. So I really understood at that moment, we lived at this watershed moment of transition of power, and it wouldn't end well. And it wouldn't end well because another cycle really I studied and was so powerful was the Kondratieff cycle of 56 years by Nikolai Kondratieff. Came in the 30s, a Russian economist, and his work was brilliant. 56-year cycles, and they marked moments of great competition. So the next thing that I highlighted is that we never fight over anything but resources. And we use excuses, religious memes, polarization. People can be resources, by the way, because slaves were once resources, but it's a resource construct. And into these peaks, basically, we went to war. So previous wars, the American Civil War, you're familiar with the First World War, 1914. At the peak of 75, essentially what we had was, the peak of the Cold War, when it was looking like the West was losing, because we'll come on to that in a minute. And the next one is 2025. So I had a power shift from west to east, and I had a 25 peak, which looked like World War III coming down the track, And I had another dynamic, the recognition that Russia basically had tried to get back into the collective Western fold when the Cold War came down. We didn't do them any favors, and we didn't embrace them like Germany and Japan. And because, interesting enough, they are a land power, they're highly hierarchical, and hierarchical land powers are not naturally suited to quick adoption of democracy. And I have a whole theory about coastlines begatting lateralism, self-responsibility, and as a consequence of that, they ceded democracy like Athens and Britain. And Russia was the anathema to that. It would have taken, a lot of money and time to help them, and we left them to it. And I was aware of the Putin having asked to join prior to 2007, and from the point onwards, and I did a lot of work in Russia, by the way, and I'd seen how Russia was run, and it was frightening. People you did business with disappeared, even back in sort of 03, 04. And by 05, it was becoming the Wild West. So I knew it was bad news. And essentially, when he made his speech in Munich, that the West had betrayed them and now the West was, I took that very seriously. Mm-hmm. So then you've got a different paradigm. Russia is not, so how do these wars start? There's two ways commodity cycles trigger wars. And I'm going to get into your question of why I knew it was going to happen. I'm not off message here. is essentially, I knew that Russia's dynamic was wealth begat the ability to rearm and assert aggression. So the Cold War can be modeled very simply on one Kondratieff cycle, starting in 1950, and the communist system, apparently the miracle of communist economies, was a complete load of claptrap because it was producing commodities. That's all that mattered. They went up in price, and by 75, the USSR had got enough money to be a military dominant, globally spreading system, and we in the West were wrapped down by inflation, economies were nailed, and anyone in the West genuinely feared that we were ever going to make it. And it looked like they were going to win, because that was the peak of the Kondratieff cycle. And the last time gold performed phenomenally because of the inflation going into it. And then, of course, the win came as the prices dropped. You saw like Volcker, so-called controlling inflation, different cycle, different reason. And you saw Reagan do the right thing of spending on defense, lowering taxes, doing a deal with the Saudis and, crushing oil. But they were just rolling the barrel down the hill. And lo and behold, bottom of the cycle, Soviet Union collapses. In 2000, that cycle started again, and I knew Putin had arrived at the beginning of the cycle. So now I see a cycle that's growing into the 2025 peak. I see committed belligerence from Putin, and I can see the revenue stream coming in to fund this process, and every alarm bell is ringing. The alarm bell on the other side was China, because China's the consumer side of the problem, where basically as prices of commodities increase, they fight to secure their resource chains, and that triggers conflict. And that's 1914 in Germany, exactly that paradigm. So I saw a situation that Russia would move to the commodity wealth aggression mode, and essentially simultaneously China would do the same for a different reason, but same outcomes. So that's the overall picture as we're moving into this period. Then there's another phenomena, which is the decline of the West begat a number of things. First of all, the printing of money by America, a classic definition of lack of productivity. Therefore, you print, and so what was 2% growth, you do twice leverage, you look 4% growth. Oops, I've got 1% growth, I'll go 4 times, I'm up to 4%. And if you go back to the low in 03, let's just say America was 3 times just after 9/11. It had found out that if it printed money, it supported its war effort, stabilized its economy, brilliant plan. So by the next low in 08, let's just say they're 10 times the leverage. Well, great, we'll get out of this. And they just keep printing, create this super bubble, make it look like they're really competitive. They're not. They've become moribund, in effect, with a few businesses that look like they're brilliant, but the fundamental structure decaying underneath it. And if you look at that process of how leadership comes up, the next thing is social parties become very encrusted into family structures where you can't get the right lateral leadership to the top because everyone is enfranchised to let their candidate or brother or sister work. So you end up with a series of terrible leaders. So terrible leaders in this case is Obama, who came from the underclass, and I'm not racist, but I made the point at the time, however brilliant this man is, when the underclass is elected, it's because the demographics have shifted from the core values that created the empire. And then what happens is they stop looking at the outside borders and they look at the social differences, and the whole system collapses because enemies on the outside start knocking at the gates. That's Obama's story. He allowed China to do those things. And then, of course, as you give away so much power, there's a secondary reaction, make me great, which Trump walked into, make me great. Mm-hmm. And he was lateral, but he had other problems. He was highly narcissistic. So he wasn't doing it for his nation, he was doing it for himself. Now you've got two disastrous presidents and everyone's getting poorer. So you can guarantee the next president's going to be one for social distribution. And that's a Democratic ticket. So whoever got the Democratic ticket was a winner. And that problem now reasserts the same Obama dynamic, which is not only do I spread wealth, but I actually forget the fact that power is required to maintain my borders. And now you're coming into the 2020 cycle of the commodity peak's greatest intensity of competitors, hegemonic challengers that are looking to undermine the order, that have spent literally 20 years on both cases working out how to undermine it, what weapons are needed to unravel the power base of America that rules the oceans. And so all those things were coming in front of us. Then if you sort of see Vladimir Putin's processes, there is nothing mad about him. This idea that he's gone, tonto, I'm here to say anyone that does is failing to understand Sun Tzu's important construct that you must understand the enemy. If you think the enemy's mad, you immediately stop trying to understand him because madness is illogical. There is nothing illogical about Putin. Every step is a milestone forwards. So the next thing that was important for Putin and Xi, and their plans were always in this time frame because they're triggered by the wealth. Putin's triggered by the wealth into his armed forces and his weapon development programs, which were coming to fruition, whether they were strategic systems or whatever else. They were all coming to this moment. And then Afghanistan came, and Biden triggered the rout, and that was an elective defeat by a man who was clearly, if you thought he was incompetent, well, you could square it. If you thought he was dangerous, man, you needed to go and put 2 layers of armor on. And the signals he sent, and they're called pilot wars, failed pilot wars in the cycle of empires, are the trigger for hegemonic challengers to start the race. From that moment onwards, the clock was ticking. So as we came into this process and the noises he was making, coupled with the wealth, the cycle, and where we were, and also the cycle in terms of our stock market rolling over, all of those signals were real to me. And I have a personal assessment of how Putin operates. And we also saw the coordination between Xi and Putin to a huge level, both with agendas to challenge in their regions. So those were the main reasons that, for me, made this the off-ramp and the moment of challenge. And then the last reason, which we joked about before, is quite simply, everyone likes to know their enemy. And everyone is ecstatic when the person opposite you is, or could be described as, incompetent when they're younger, even more incompetent when they're older, highly linear and highly predictable, arrogant in their thought that they understand the world around them, and at a stage when they can barely stand an electum, and is proven to have made a strategic, disastrous move without any apology whatsoever. That was the moment when they said, if we don't go now, he'll die in office. And I'm joking about it, but I would be thinking, go now before something happens to him because he's our ideal enemy. And then you saw the construct where you could see Putin setting up the impossible conundrum. Either NATO bars Ukraine and in one single go literally is lost, or he's going to invade. And if you look at his character, he's never not followed through on a threat. He doesn't play poker. He says what he's going to do, and the threat follows through. It wasn't difficult. And then the last piece was the force structure. And if you looked at the force structure, that force structure was never about playing. And as we moved past the date of December, you could see it happening because in Iraq, before we invaded, or before we, whatever word we use for our interactions, we had live firing exercises. And when we finished the live firing exercises and the tempo of the troops was critical, they just turned it into a real exercise. So the moment they became live firing exercises, really, there is no doubt about it. Whatever minuscule amount was left ended. So that was why. And then I was also able to predict when people were saying he's having a little bit in the east, a little bit over here. No, he's going for the whole country because he needs to push NATO back to shorten his lines because the European plane funnels in the Baltic region, and he has to go and take Ukraine out of the picture. There's a couple of other pieces too that people don't understand. And that is Ukraine. Huge resources were found in Ukraine in 2012. And I'm convinced that's one of the reasons why the West fomented a revolution that really was a revolution too far. I suspect, especially with the state of our armament program. It's one thing going east, it's another thing when you're unable to protect your interests when you move east. And that was our hubris and arrogance. I say it was probably a leftover of neoconservatism and coupled with European greed, because what they saw in Ukraine was an alternative gas source to Russia. And once you realize that, Putin has to knock it out, because he's basically working a dependence ploy on Europe. And if Ukraine in the middle popped up, then that ploy disappears, and he really has a problem. So there's a strategic piece as well as thinking it's an integrated function. It's important in the strategic location for his defense of, the eastern front of the Russian Empire. And this energy competition issue, which is rarely talked about. And when he grabbed Crimea, he grabbed all the offshore oil fields off Crimea that were being developed. That was his first grab, the ones closest to production. That wasn't an accident either. So this man is really cunning. He's really logical. And when I hear the West think we've got him in this vice grip of sanctions, it's almost laughable, because quite simply, Russia is a commodity producing country. It now has a willing partner in the form of China who will buy all the commodities it produces. It doesn't need the West. And we are a consumer society, and we know what happened into the last 75 peak. It was almost a disaster. But this time we're innumerably weaker. So I'm afraid our idea that sanctions and economic warfare will bring him to heel is actually not just wrong, it's the opposite. And we're in big trouble.
David, there's so much to dig into there, but I'd like to dig into some of, let's say, the specifics. So, do you see a NATO war with Putin as an inevitable outcome in this current conflict?
So let's just look at this force structure that and the preparation that Putin put into play here. So the weapons we see, not just on the battlefield, but the strategic weapons which ensure that his deterrent works. His force structure is a guaranteed nuclear deterrent with hypersonic weapon delivery, with sub-drone delivery called Poison, which is a 70-foot nuclear drone that travels with a 2-megaton warhead underwater with a specific submarine class to launch it, designed to get under any anti-ballistic screen and turn up in New York Harbor. It's specifically designed to circumvent Western technology. You could argue it's deterrent maintenance, but it's designed to get around. And their long-range strategic missile system, which is upgraded, make them a nuclear power that we have a problem with, because they can take us all too. The thing that he created was this thing called escalate to de-escalate. So if we have a problem on a land battlefield, we have assessed that essentially Western leadership is weak. So if we drop a small tactical nuke on them, they're going to back off because they fear it's going to all go tits up. And the result is I get freedom to act. And that's exactly what you're seeing essentially in Ukraine. Now, it's a little bit worse than that, because the route that led to this starts with the release of chemical weapons in Syria. The reason why Obama was so upset about it was because it was the beginning of overt chemical use, weapons of mass destruction, and Putin supported Assad in their use. That was breaking the convention of Cold War, where 3 weapons of mass destruction essentially all were linked. So nuclear weapons, chemical weapons, biological weapons. In the Cold War, if you use any one of them, you got a nuke on your head. Not possible. So that was the beginning of the corrosion. The massive corrosional moment was in Salisbury in Britain when he used Novichok. And Britain maybe turned the lights out on someone's residency or dacha. And that was when Putin knew he had broken the linkage. And so once you break the linkage, you break the mindset of defensive intent. And so what he's done by making these 4 threats, and the point I would make is that everyone's saying he thought it was going to be easy and it wasn't. Well, if he thought it was really going to be easy to get into Ukraine, he wouldn't have had those nuclear exercises to demonstrate his ultimate power. Mm-hmm. That you only have that under the assumption of de-escalation, that you might have a sticky experience. So that's point 1. That wasn't what he thought. He thought probably, I'll try it. I'll send my light forces in, and if we're lucky, we'll get it in 3 days. But what I really think I'm going to do is I'm going to stir the hornet's nest up. And my working thesis about the way they're operating is quite simply, he knew that 44 million people spread over Ukraine, you couldn't occupy them with the forces he has. So he needs to completely destroy the fighting will of the Ukrainians. And I mean, destroy every piece of it. And now if you're going to do that, and you think like a Russian, and the Russians do think a certain way from the Eastern Front to obviously this campaign, what you basically do is you send your light forces in, you stir up the hornet's nest, you make people think they're going to be successful. So essentially, they all rise up and say, I'll join, because if they thought they're going to lose, they all bugger off across the borders and not fight. Mm-hmm. You leave the radio stations operating, so they keep saying, come, come. You have social organization. Every living man who can fight turns up at those cities. You then surround those cities and you kill everyone in them. And after that, the country succumbs. I think that's his working strategy. And the reason why that strategy is there is this isn't just the final destination for him. This is a stepping stone to breaking the NATO wall, Finland and the Baltic states. He didn't spend 15 years rearming to stop at this point. Mm-hmm. And so we do have in the West a major problem. We are going to have to front out this nuclear blackmail, which inhibits us from action. And I think that even on the NATO wall, you will see inhibition against the use of nuclear weapons, which he knows. So we're on the back foot. And my personal view is, I'll give you two options. One is our leadership continues with this process. We watch the brave Ukrainians die and eradicated. And then we find we're doing exactly the same in Finland or the Baltic states. How do we feel about that? We feel like we really, really let those courageous people die, and when we should have actually stood. And I think that's the question we should be answering, because it's inevitable. If he gets away with this, there will be another one. Mm-hmm. So we've got some big stuff happening, really big stuff. And the other thing that I'd say about what we're seeing is that we are so behind his decision curve. So if you look at the northern column, there's every single sign of complete incompetence, poor tires, poor logistics, bravery, interdiction of the logistical train. I mean, some really amazing stuff. But if you look at every other arm of the advance, it's like a slow encirclement, unstoppable. And the truth is, they are going to be suffocated and destroyed. There is no way out. We can't live with the hope of heroes, and they're becoming more desperate because they sense that. And I feel an awful lot for their situation. It's like Britain, really, in 1940, when America wouldn't help because they were told that Kennedy's, Uncle Kennedy, Joe Kennedy, said that Britain won't survive, and we did. And the longer they survive, hopefully it'll have the same effect as Britain's success on America did, that we realize actually that what's happening is not just a one-off event. And our other problem is that this, I don't believe, is a singular event. The Chinese are a strategic partnership, and we will see South Korea, which is not talked about, and Taiwan simultaneously suffer the same fate. And their goal is to overwhelm Biden in office, whoever follows him when he doesn't make it, and whoever follows that person when they don't make it. So we're in a sequential problem. And at the same time, we've got a market problem now, because I would say the Doomsday Bubble, as I call it, this bubble at the end of an empire that America's created, I was able to predict very precisely its high in the NASDAQ through some mathematical numbers as we came off 150, 15,000, and it was actually 16,774, and it got to 16,75, and it reversed. And for all the people that take my global trader product, they got short right at the high maximum size, still have it. But what we are in, and if you look at the European markets like Eurostoxx, they are breaking down in the proximity to this problem. And you're talking about low growth in Europe and super inflation, so massive stagflation and the threat of conflict. There's nothing good about that story. And essentially they're breaking down and the US markets will follow. So with or without this, that's happening anyway. And that collapse is disabling, coupled with the struggle we have. And Putin has many more tools in his box to counter us, which we started to talk about before we went live.
So as we think about the consequences of this current conflict, with the EU relying so heavily on Russia's gas, will they be the hardest hit by this conflict, obviously, other than the Ukraine at this point? Or is this entire, energy bubble going to hit everyone? As I was reading a stat the other day that the US imports something like 25% of its refined gasoline from Russia at this point as well.
Well, it's going to hit everyone. And ultimately, I think we will stop taking anything. I mean, how can you fight a war, which we say isn't a war, but we're giving them lethal aid? British NLAWs, we gave them 2,000, and probably a good 60% of those killed a Russian vehicle if they've all been used. They're so good. I can't think that Putin differentiates between the Ukrainians and us who supplied weapons. Hitler didn't. when America started providing weapons for us in 1940, and the ships that they came across started to be torpedoed by German U-boats. America provided warships to protect them, and it was at war with Germany well before it declared war against Germany after Pearl Harbor. And in fact, that's exactly where NATO is, and especially Britain. So we are there. It's to kid ourselves is not to. And it amazes me that we haven't mobilized ourselves. We haven't increased defense in a quantum way from a dribbly sort of 2% to 5%. We haven't sent signals that we understand this is a kinetic struggle. It's like the good old sort of belief that diplomacy is going to do it and these are the biggest sanctions. And it's a delusion we have. The only thing that matters now is kinetic power and intention, and everything else is an adjunct and support for that. So we've got some, we really do have some horrible realizations to come. We still haven't learned our lesson.
David, you mentioned the importance of the relationship between China and Russia, and I was wondering if we could dig more into that. Is China really kind of has to see Putin and Russia succeed in this at this point?
Well, that is the thing I think most people don't appreciate, is essentially just because China isn't saying anything means nothing. It's very simple. Putin has put a lot on the line to do this. And if he fails, there's every chance he will be knocked off his perch. And there's every chance that what comes next is a pro-Western Russian leadership. For the Chinese, that means they lose their ally, they lose their secure source of resources, which comes across the land border and not the sea. They're surrounded to the north, and the West is supported in the flow of commodities directly to it, to China's preclusion. It is an epic strategic conundrum that China is in, and it cannot afford to let that happen. So we are not just fighting Russia, we are essentially fighting China, because China's interests support Russians. That's part of their platform. The other part that's very important for the Chinese is the Russian nuclear umbrella, because the Chinese strategic nuclear deterrent is still very small and really doesn't equate to American power. It can't live with mutually assured destruction. But if it's allied to Russia, it's adopted that umbrella. And right now, as the commodity cycle super kicks in, and by means super kicking in, we're talking about oil not coming back, it fills the gap and keeps going, then essentially its plans to whatever it did to move forward into Taiwan and North Korea and extend its sphere of influence are accelerated by the price of commodities. So we sort of, it's been molded into a giant piece of plasticine, which is rolling down the hill to us. And, my belief is our only separation, our only ability to separate that now formed mass in one giant ball of plasticine is to literally definitively act in Ukraine. And it's a bold call, and I understand all its implications, because first you have to face down the nuclear threat, which I believe is a logical threat to face down. And then you need to impose not an air denial. You literally need to you say in 6 hours you move out or everything disappears. And that would be a signal that would possibly collapse Putin and create change, if there's any hope of it. For certain reasons we can cover, I'm not so hopeful, but something extreme might just do that, because the longer we wait, the more formed that Russian-Chinese partnership is, and we're facing two of them, and we're just waiting for the hammer blow somewhere in the Pacific. And the moment that happens, the whole of NATO is now alone, because the reinforcement capability of America, which has one enemy, disappears, and we've got all sorts of problems. So I think it's a much bigger and more complex strategic picture, and time is not on our side, either to win the economic wars we talked about, or in terms of the alliance structure and the threats we face.
So you mentioned, much of Russia's wealth has been built on the commodities that it has been blessed with. So with commodity prices across the board surging, where are we in your model of how the commodity cycle plays out here, David?
So we are under, like a slightly modified Kondratieff wave, which is essentially, think about oil and think of the A wave was sort of into, 2010, that real first spike. And then you had this massive period, almost a decade, down into the lows of 2020, although it was stepped, where commodities were really going down. Now, for Russia, they were still very, very high versus their production rates. So they were still their treasuries were filling up. But our margin was narrowing. And I long since argued if we were going to turn Russia, it had to be near the low of 2020, because following that low, we would end up with a move to $300 to $400. Prices are just difficult to comprehend, that essentially he would be unstoppable through his revenues and arrogance. Mm-hmm. And we didn't. We missed that opportunity completely. There was another prediction I made, which is post the low, and because of the COVID suffering and because of the process of the economy and the demand of commodities being low, that I predicted Putin about 8 months afterwards would be vulnerable to revolution of some kind. And so was able to predict well before it happened the space where Navalny could act. I strongly suspect that the Western intelligence agencies took every opportunity to support that, and Putin must be aware of it. So much as we moan about him being involved in elections, that's another reason why I felt that he was truly vengeful. And if there was any doubt in my other senses of pictures of invasion, that was a driver for him. So it's amazing. So right now he is sitting there thinking, sanctions, you think, really? China buys all my commodities. You guys, your lights get turned out. You guys suffer from massive inflation, and you guys think you're doing a really good job with your sanctions. I get to execute my military doctrine. I've scared the pants off you with my nuclear threat. I mean, what's not to like, really?
Mm-hmm. So as we think about this real energy shock coming for the rest of the world, do you feel, David, that the move towards green energy has been, short-sighted in a lot of ways?
So look, I in breaking the code of history, I mean, my background is geophysics. So there's a whole sector on climate change, and climate change was really like, a druggie's domain when I started writing my thesis back in 01, 02. Mm-hmm. And so I came at it from a very open perspective, and I was quite shocked because, first of all, as a physicist, when I look at these climate models, I just think there are so many variables in that model, and their interrelation between the variables, I can't trust them. Mm-hmm. How can you trust any prediction unless you find something that essentially incorporates all the data? Now, my work is about collective human behavioral patterns in markets, which later I expanded into geopolitical domains, and I look at prices. Prices in markets are correlated to collective behavioral patterns. And every single person's feelings and perspectives who is a participant is in that price. And I love that concept, right? And once you start to apply sophisticated models, the basis of my predictions in markets falls from that. And from that also, going backwards after 9/11, I reverse engineered the social model, increased its fractal size, and that's where my 5 stages of empire process came from. I looked at the 800-year ice cores from Vladivostok, and they were fascinating because they incorporate all the data, the same concepts as a chart. And you can see this large sinusoidal system, self-regulation, too much, too little, self-contained. And then you see the onset of industrialization, and it's literally the ppms go through the roof, break the outside. And there's one thing you know in the process: whatever self-regulating, modulating climate we had, we bust. So we know it's not going to be the same. First conclusion. Mm-hmm. You have to be a moron to think it's going to be the same. So is it going to be better or worse? Well, then you look at the correlation between CO2 and temperature. And it's really obvious. CO2 leads temperature, and essentially it may have a lead lag of 20, 30 years because you've got all the heat sinks in the oceans, but essentially there's a correlation. And at the whatever it was levels when I published the book implied an 11-degree temperature change. So I looked at that and I fell off my chair because we were talking 2 degrees and it would all be a nightmare. Mm-hmm. 11 degrees is we've cooked ourselves. We shouldn't be talking about like stopping putting it in. We should be talking about how do we get it out, like rapidly. And I have ever since been there and argued that it is about getting it out. And these changes would be hugely exacerbating to this power change as resources, climate had more energy, water levels rose. It would make it worse. But before we got to that level, our challenge was surviving the nuclear war that we could create in World War III. So I had a very clear priority of what was the priority. And for me, I would have integrated strategic energy resourcing with strategic energy requirements to combat the threat of hegemonic challenge. Mm-hmm. The fact that, the liberal Greens got the idea that, flower power wins, I don't agree with and never have. And that is a fundamental error. But it's the very same people that can't see a war either. They thought that history had ended, democracy lived forever, everyone's like us, or I can't imagine someone like Putin actually torturing someone, even though the evidence is overwhelming. He's been here for a long time. But essentially, it's that mindset. So I looked at this country, and the lunacy of losing our base loading and not nuclear energy is stunning to me. And I would have long since put our money into thorium reactors. Thorium reactors are the way to go. And if we modularize thorium reactors such that we could export them, there's no nuclear weapons implication. We could be the country in Britain that makes them en masse and develop countries buy them. And they're easy to service. And I had that vision 20 years ago, and it's just no one's even seen it. I talked about it in Breaking the Code of History, and the failure to do that, I think, is part of the reason why we're really in trouble. And one fed into the other. We gave Putin another lever.
David, you mentioned the Doomsday Bubble. Are you using that term to describe the multi-pronged asset bubble that we currently find in the US?
Yes, it's exactly what it is. So bubbles, have been with us all over the place. But this is the bubble of decline, which I predicted, back, where inefficiencies and lack of productivity and adaptation in the American economy would be compensated for by good old money printing. And there's been so much of it, it's gone in, as you say, to just about every asset class. Daffodils, bulbs, you name it, they've all got the uplift from it. And it's gone on for so long that it's also done something else. It's very interesting, this, is that it's so in a bubble and a trend pattern created like this, all of the lateral trading mavericks who are alpha generators have been spat out. Every person at the top of a financial institution will be a linear person. So the byproduct of creating this bubble is you've created the illusion that the system's lasted for longer, rather than taking the medicine and done the adaptation early. And you've actually just got rid of every lateral thinking person in every key aspect. So we have everyone can't see what was coming, even though using a lateral process, it was very obvious what was coming, but they still can't see the magnitude of what's coming. And that's essentially how they get washed away. And so the irony is the thing that was designed to protect actually is the thing that truly finishes the system. And there's something else that it does at the same time. Bubbles create huge amounts of happy drugs like serotonin and, testosterone, because aren't they great? Aren't they making money? And if you go and look at a herd of humans in a field eating grass, they're high on their drugs. And the sheepdogs are saying, wolf, wolf, wolf. No, I just got to just have another blade here. It's going really well. There's a wolf over there. No, the drugs are flying. The blade's great. And that's why we couldn't see, I believe, the threat of Russia and China, because collectively we were on the dopamine on a massive scale. Now, as you roll over the top, the cortisol's starting to flow. It's flowing in Europe. It's not flowing in America because it's a European problem, but it's about to flow. It should be flowing when you get a nuclear threat to global peace, and it should be flowing when you start to see commodities. But again, it's more European-centric. Oil and WTI is your first sign that something is seriously big. The great thing for America is, the cut-in for all of its oil industries at $40, and literally it does have a hedge. It can start producing en masse, and your oil industry is about to go and boom as a result of it because break even so much lower. But it takes time, and there's a lot of short-term pain before that adaptation.
So what do you see as the outcome for the US dollar as part of this decline at this point?
Well, the US dollar has been declining for some decades, actually, and it has one of the most clear patterns, long-term patterns of a currency next to cable, funnily enough, or dollar sterling, which looks like it's about to be a massive gainer. So I think, I say to people, if you want one currency in your book, be long of sterling, because sterling's going to 2. And the dollar is going to lose 30% of its value, and it's linked to the loss of hegemonic power. Now, I'd say we've just seen another great demonstration of loss of hegemonic power as the Ukrainian people are massacred, and America sits back and says, no, we're not going to do anything. That's a terrible sign, especially when America guaranteed its peace when they gave up their nuclear weapons, desperately trying to conveniently forget it. But America was the guarantor of Ukraine. Now, an example of an empire with much more power and will, even though it was in decline, was Britain in 1914. The story is very interesting because you had the same hegemonic challenge as Germany, as China is now. It had adopted sea power, which was not as natural force structure, because it knew that becoming a global hegemon required becoming a global sea power. So it had been in a dreadnought arms race against Britain and was kind of losing, but knew it couldn't get any further, had lost. And it planned to replicate the 1870 invasion of France. And Lloyd George, who was head of the Liberals, Biden-esque, I'd say, basically said that we wouldn't intervene as a country if that happened. And the Kaiser heard what he wanted to hear. It wasn't from the government, it was from the opposition. The attack started, and they made a small mistake. They went through Belgium. Just happened that Britain was a guarantor of Belgium. And the concept was poor little Belgium, and we were in the war. Ill-prepared in many ways, in a continental form, but we came in. Actually, you think about the parallels of America being, the guarantor over Ukraine, poor little Ukraine. Mm-hmm. It shows you how much weaker America is than Britain was in 1914. And we struggled to hold back that hegemonic challenge.
So is there any part of the West that will see expansion, or is basically the entire West on that downward slope of the destruction of that empire?
So this surprised me, because when I broke Breaking the Code of History, I thought Britain, Europe, America were all in that terminal decline phase. Mm-hmm. But I created a number of models and things that to watch out for that signaled the advent of national energy. And national energy is this sort of growthful dynamic within a system that finds expression with or without leadership, funny enough. It'll do it anyway, but with good leadership, it will shine. And that is quite simply the advancing of a country through the medal tables. So you can see Germany, rising into 33, although many people didn't turn up for the Olympics. You can see, East Germany and Russia in the Cold War. And you can see China coming through as it rose through the tables. And suddenly there was Britain, number 3. And I remember scratching my head thinking, that's interesting. How did we do that? Now, we had a lottery system that provided money and channeled it. Well, that sounds simple. But the truth is, hang on a second, we become wealthy enough to create a lottery. We then channel that lottery into competitive spirit. We did it in organized fashion, and we produce success through competition. That's national energy. Anyway, I remember thinking, I wonder, and then along came our second result when we were second. It was just irrefutable. And at the same time, we had the Brexit Party with Farage, which was really, at the time, more a protest dynamic. Mm-hmm. And then the penny clocked. This was the rise of British national energy. We had restarted our cycle with Thatcher in 79 as a starting point. We defined ourselves by our success in the Falklands War. And essentially, we were embarking on a regional civil war to separate ourselves from Europe and to once more become sovereign. And so when good old Cameron decided to have, his referendum, I knew at that moment we were leaving. And I made the prediction. The day he announced it, I said, that is going to result in a leave decision. Mm-hmm. And I was in a complete minority. And again, it was a lateral linear process where the linear people and linear mindsets of the urban cities were very different from those that were essentially in the countryside, more individualistic, greater sort of space between them, which is one of the hallmarks. And I was able to track that process. So Boris represents lateral leadership. And what we've demonstrated since, and everyone said, you're going to become insular and going to become irrelevant. I said, no, what you're going to do is unshackle yourself from the Titanic, which is a system in Europe, which is unsustainable under my 5 stages of empire model because its demographics are negative at the core. Mm-hmm. And no system has ever survived that process. Even if you add demographics and expansive from the outside, it's like the whole process of Obama coming in, the underclass taking control, the values change and the productivity changes. So my argument was actually we would return to a global maritime paradigm. And we would start to fill the gap as America lost its influence and become incredibly influential, because for us, we're just remembering its muscle memory of what we were, hopefully in a slightly different form. And so the speed at which Britain has adopted that post-Brexit global maritime paradigm is exactly as I thought, surprises everyone, and it's quite impressive. But there's one massive deficit from a normal construct. On the one side, it was done peacefully, which is incredible. It gives me hope that we as humans can change, because changing and controlling that social cooking pot, which creates that regional civil war, is so powerful that no one's ever done it before. But our construct of law and democracy meant that Britain did it. The downside is that because the war wasn't total between the lateral and linear thinkers, there are a whole lot of linear people left in government at the civil service level that didn't get washed aside in the combat and essentially are sitting there trying to reverse a decision and inhibit lateral thinking it's irresponsible. So we kind of haven't created our complete social transformation yet. And we've struggled through the sort of entropy effects of the pandemic. It's not a coincidence that we did well with our vaccine program, because that's another sign of adaptation and lateralization. And it's not a coincidence that we saw Ukraine's danger before anywhere else and started screaming earlier and actively by giving them non-lethal weapons. Our problem is we need to spend money on defense so that our words and our actions are matched with the capability to defend our interests, our partners, and ourselves. Mm-hmm. And that's a bit we've seemed to have conveniently, dangerously forgotten.
So, David, you've painted this entire, let's say, geopolitical risk picture for us. Very, very colorfully. You've shaded in all the areas. So, what do you see, as part of, let's say, the personal hedging strategy here? Do you see metals as a safe haven? Or commodities in general? How do you see? So,
I've advocated one structure for family offices, for high net worth individuals, and that is the precious metal strategy. Great entry points we've had recently in that whole correction we've broken out of, that let you basically buy with little volatility for this leg upwards, which was going to be a shooter. And my argument is gold will again become a financial metal, because having printed so much money, there will have to be a return to something that is a hard standard as inflation works its way through the system. Silver will become a financial metal because there's not enough gold. And platinum will become a financial metal because there's not enough gold. And just about anything that's shiny will. So I can see this financialization being the whole metal group. Even palladium fits that kind of quality as a semi-rare process. So I put them all in the group. I am truly... Back in 02 and 02-ish, we built a whole portfolio of miners and Lukoil and Russian oil companies, and literally we made out like bandits. So I know what it's like to buy things at cents and see them sell them 100 times more. And in my opinion, the conditions that we're in now for the mining stocks, in a place where essentially you're seeing a collapse of the Doomsday Bubble, is phenomenal in its own right. It should completely race the inflationary cycle. And at the same time, if you're a long short equity fund, there's only one player you want, because you can be long on this stuff genuinely. And there's something else actually, a really nice piece. I love US Steel. US Steel is a dead sexy business, because when the Chinese stop providing steel and the wall comes down with them too, then essentially that's really, really exciting. So that thing's been going out like a rocket, because you're looking at substitution for previously provided Chinese raw resources and metal industry. So think like that, and there'll be safe havens. But a simple safe haven is this gold complex. And my argument is you buy the best gold shares, not the weakest ones. This isn't the time for the weakest ones. Just buy the best ones, and the best ones are performing better. I think that's simple. I think it's a game changer and a chance for generational wealth. And some of it later on. My concern slightly about more industrial products and metals is that we haven't seen the collapse of the Doomsday Bubble feed through, but there is going to be a demand hit somewhere on top of an inflationary hit and a war squeeze. And there's a navigational challenge to get through that. So that's why I still prefer financial metals over perhaps some of the other, base resource dynamics. But I do think oil companies are going to have a pretty rosy time at the rate we're going. And in terms of multiplicities of return, I think, Henry Hub natural gas, it looks to me like almost an equity buy. Really does down here. Because if you look at European gas, it's gone back up to its highs. That's a 3 or 4 times return, quite simply in that. And, you are going to see a feedback where America provides gas for Europe. That's the obvious, everyone's going to be providing gas, but the Russians. So the LNG business is going to boom.
David, when we think about, let's say, that appreciation of the miners, do you think that a big part of it is just the rotation of capital coming away from growth and into that value that those PM miners provide?
Well, look, first of all, there are all sorts of problems around derivatives in gold that I think will hold up to certain levels, and beyond certain levels, there could be real deliverable issues. Gold miners, you're buying the gold that's physically in the ground. It's deliverable. So I think there's a nice, neat way of avoiding that physical gold ownership. So that's neat. I think the people that buy gold and silver understand that inflation is an issue. It's quite simple. And this generation of fund managers over the past decade will not be able to remember having a really good experience in gold and silver, especially the one that's about to come. So it'll be a lateral thinking group of people that are involved at this stage. And certainly it's not popular. It's not like, we've been, you say gold and there's a million people knocking through your door. It's not there yet. It's just the beginning. And silver, for example, is a lagger, but it's just like an equity. It's an equity kicker that can be like a Saturn V rocket. So, those things are all coming to us.
So, it'd be interesting to get your view on where you see if there is a role for cryptocurrencies going forward here as well.
Crypto question. So, in the long term, I think they're flawed because quantum computers are going to rip blockchain apart. So, not a long-term solution. But it is a solution when your hegemonic currency is going down the toilet. And, as an interim mechanism, it's appealing for anyone that wants an alternative and different, transmission processes. It's not going to be long before it becomes fully and utterly, dare I say it, regularized as, by the central banks, because they're going to be fearful of sanction busting and everything else. But right now, it's a piggy bank for a bunch of speculators. And in the work I do, it's produced some of the most beautiful patterns. So at the last two highs within, a couple of K, I've been able to take the reversal point and go mega short. And I'm still short from 66 from this move. And my target's sub 23. So as we get to those lows, there is a possibility that I might be reversing the whole process, depending on the last piece of price action. But right now, I think you just want to look at cryptocurrency as a piggy bank that people are going to raid to fund their other disastrous investments.
That's very succinctly put, David. So, as you've developed such a comprehensive view here, where do you see, let's say, the price of gold and silver going, by that 2024, 2025 timeframe, maybe? So
if you just think of how much money we printed, and you think of if you need to, go to a metal standard, I keep thinking of a giant trying to get in a size 10 shoe. And he's not going to do it without breaking the shoe. So I think, the levels that we could go to are going to be astounding. 10 times current prices, 5 times. You're talking about something where there's just not enough to go around. Imagine a place where inflation is 3 times higher than we are now. Interest rates in the 10 years of 15%. We're talking about an inflation shock that makes previous shocks look, like they're just beginners. So those numbers, I think, are huge. And one of the things that I've learned about when you get into some trades is you don't set yourself targets. You just know there's an open window for the rocket to fly through, and you read it. And you don't sit there thinking, I'm going to make X. But I think I haven't seen a target that I think is excessive anywhere in the public domain. And I don't think 10,000 is excessive. 5 times increase in gold and silver isn't when you look at the conditions. I think gold and silver will actually trade like an equity type return.
And I guess the other part of that is the measuring gold in US dollars, right? That is the destruction of that dollar.
You mentioned that. So what are you going to have? Ruble gold? Well, I tell you, we talked earlier. I do actually think Putin would be smart to go on a gold standard. It's hilarious. They have 18% of GDP. They have a debt profile to die for. We forget that, they got to $640 billion of reserves, which shows you how much money the system prints. And essentially, so they're a petrocurrency, and they suddenly made it stuck it on gold. They would be sticking their finger up at the fiat currencies of Europe. And I don't know whether I saw rumors, I'm not convinced it's confirmed, but having seen it, it's a very logical step because it just shows how strong his economic position is. And it puts a shoe on the other foot for Europe. Bigger currency blocks just don't have a chance, like the dollar. There's just too many dollars in circulation they printed to get them into anything. So again, there's a lot of upside. Where do you go with it? Well, you can't choose if you're a Western society, the ruble and the renminbi are, the devil. So don't look for that, because I don't think our economies are going to be intermixed for long. As we pulled out of the Russian economy, the Chinese economy will do the same. And I've been warning people that we're in China. What were they doing? Essentially, when you try and get your hand out, your fingers are coming off your lucky, maybe your wrist and probably your arm. You're going to leave everything on the table, and they're not going to let you keep it. So, why don't you start unwinding the position sooner than you actually you get a fingernail out or something? So I do think it's a terribly dangerous process. And the reason why I'm so sure about that process is I've tracked the way the Chinese plan worked against us. So they changed their plan after they were into an overt challenge up until the third Taiwan Straits crisis in 96. Those two carriers and that Mu group that sailed through made them realize they couldn't. And the demonstrations in Iraq was just too much. So they reverted to a covert strategy. They understood that we believed that if they became capitalists, they would become democratic. They dangled that carrot and hope. We projected our hope onto it. We had the other beautiful idea that we could give them all our manufacturing and lower our inflation, which worked. And they had a beautiful idea saying, why don't you fund our manufacturing base? We'll denude you of yours in the process. We'll steal all your IP. Then we'll have the biggest arms building base anywhere. And when it comes to an arms race, we'll whop your ass. And we did that. So they deceived us. They didn't, unlike China, Russia, which is slightly different. These Chinese guys literally ripped our faces off. So I can't see the renminbi being, the currency. There's one currency I do think is really going to come back, and that's sterling. It's a smaller currency block. It's the only expansive system. If it shifts to a global, like a maritime hegemon paradigm, then you spend money on defense, as we talked earlier. Unlike a big standing army, which doesn't do much until it's fighting, a navy secures your trade routes, impresses your allies and friends, increases trade relationships, and creates an investment return, which is why Britain, as a global maritime power, was the most wealthy nation by a quanta, and the Dutch were before. And we still haven't fully understand the lesson. Defense in fixed stationary mechanisms is expensive and a fixed burden, but in the maritime concept, it's a revenue producer. Just we haven't worked out that you can attribute that revenue. So I think sterling's my favorite. If I had to choose, a new currency for the dollar in the Western world, it's going to be gold and sterling.
Would there be an advantage for the ruble going to a gold-backed model first? Well,
if I was Putin, those rumors I'd make true, because it's really exciting. What you're saying is, I have enough gold to be the first gold standard currency. I don't need it because I'm a petrocurrency, by the way, which is just phenomenal. But I'm doing it to say, screw you. Oh, and by the way, I'd like to compare your currency with mine. Look at my debt. Look at your debt. You're printing. I'm not printing. It really is psychologically powerful. It kills the run on the ruble. It means that you can get the ruble into the Chinese central banks because, man, they want that. And India, well, we know what they did, or Brazil, or suddenly all these EM BRIC countries are going to go and have rubles in their central bank portfolio because it's gold-backed. It's a no-brainer. I'd be doing that just to show who I was. And I'm sure not one single bright spark who told our leaders that sanctions will work thought about that.
Yeah, it definitely seems quite short-sighted on the US's part. But
well, not the US, it's European. The trouble is that the people doing this don't understand how these cycles operate, and therefore haven't learned the lessons of history, which are so obvious. And their construct is just a continuum of blank experiences where, you hit the billiard ball, it hits another ball. Well, what we're talking about is someone's just tipped the table up a lot and all the balls are going downhill, and they can't see that.
And that would serve another purpose for China as well, considering that, their declared gold holdings are something like 1,900 tons. But, I've heard estimates somewhere anywhere between 20,000 to 40,000 tons of gold.
You've got gold there. What are they? 360 tons a year officially declared. Well, that they never, these people never declare anything. And especially when it comes to the fact that if I have a hidden advantage, and that is a hidden advantage. So Yeah, I think what you're looking at is a concerted effort by these two strategic partners to undermine the currency system of the West. And we've engaged in that economic conflict, but the boomerang is going to come back and smack us very badly.
Mm-hmm. Well, David, I really appreciate you shedding light on all of these topics for us today. Is there anything else you'd like to touch on before we wrap up today?
Yeah, I'm sorry that I didn't realize this was a video interview when I was looking the other way and just had my head and my chin on the table. So I apologize for everyone if I look punched.
Not a problem. Of course, you're available on Twitter at Global Forecast R and davidmurrin.co.uk, right?
Yeah, I mean, if people are interested about the work we do, I'd encourage them to engage the site because it is different levels of engagement. The global forecaster portion is for everyone in the public domain who wishes to really understand how we got here and how we might be able to navigate out of here. And it isn't designed just to say, you listen to me, this is what you should do. It offers you the constructs that I've used to design the ideas we've discussed. So to empower our readers and followers to basically have their own ideas and views to interpret and become independent. Mm-hmm. And that's our goal, not by rote dissemination, but actually empowerment through understanding. And for people in the public, it costs less than a paper a month, but it will advance and show you things that are happening you didn't expect, predict Ukraine before other people. It has track records of our predictions, and it's really designed to help this movement of aware Western publics to demand more of their leaders through their own knowledge. So I'd really urge you all, if you've heard it, to get on there. And then from there, if you trading arms or whatever else, you can go up through the higher levels. But start with that, and hopefully you've enjoyed some of the perspectives that we've discussed.
I know. I certainly enjoyed a lot of this conversation here today, David.
A lot. Was there something you didn't enjoy, Tom?
Well, there's so much to think about and chew on. I have to digest it all first.
Yeah. Well, someone called me Johnny Mnemonic, which Anyway, it's been a great pleasure, Tom. Thank you for the privilege of talking to you.
Thank you, David. Thanks so much for your time today. This podcast is for general informational purposes only. Nothing on this podcast should be taken as investment advice. Guests on this show are not compensated for their appearance. Listeners are urged to educate themselves and make their own decisions. Do not base any investment decisions on the information contained. To view our full disclaimer, please visit our website.